So for our project today we're going to work in soft pastel, and I've got a variety of soft pastels here. You'll probably only have one set, so don't worry. I'm also going to be using some pastel pencils, possibly to refine the work, and again don't worry if you don't have those, because you can just use any of these soft pastel sets. So these are the Inscribe soft pastels, and these are a brand called Rembrandt, and they're much of a muchness, to be honest. If you buy the smaller number sets, you're going to get larger sticks but less colours, and if you go for the sets which are like 48, then you'll get the half sticks, but you'll have a much larger array of colours. The other thing you're going to want to have to hand are your trusty baby wipes, because your hands will get very dusty and covered in different colours as you work. And the other thing you're going to need is some pastel paper. This is actually what we call a toned ground, and I've shown this particular pad before. It has a variety of colours. Again, you can work on white or you can work on black. It really does not make much of a difference. Today I'm going to be using this rather nice navy shade, because the background of our work is actually going to be quite dark. So that's all you need to get started. So I'm going to just move these things to one side. And these are the things that I'm potentially going to use. And this is probably the set that I will work from in the main. So the first thing that I'm going to need to do is to take my paper, and I'm going to tape that down onto my work surface. So here's my trusty masking tape. Actually, we're going to be working portrait, so I will do it this way, and I suggest that you do the same. And take this corner here, and this one, and this one down here. It doesn't matter how ugly your pieces of masking tape look, don't worry too much. They don't have to be regular or neat and tidy. As long as they do the job, that's all that matters really. So the colours that we're going to be using today, we're going to be using some of these turquoisey colours. So I'll go for a light and a dark turquoise, and then perhaps a bright green, and some of these lovely yellowy orangey colours too. Might be rather nice, and a darker orange, and I'm also going to need a darker green. I might wish to use this one just in case I want to put some highlights, so I'll just put him over there. And possibly we'll be using some darker values. So I've got some black here. I've also got quite a, if you can see, it's quite a dark grey. We might also use either a sort of purple or a blue, so I'm going to put those in the might use section over here. You can already see my fingers are getting a little bit dirty from handling the pastels. If your pastels are very well used, then what you might want to do before you use them, I'll just demonstrate. So you can see this has been used previously. And when we handle particularly the pale coloured pastels, what tends to happen is we get kind of handling marks on them. So if you want to, you can just use a clean dry cloth, and particularly where you're going to actually be working with the pastel, so the ends of the pastel, you might want to just give that a bit of a wipe. You can see that's quite dirty there. So you don't have to go through and clean your entire set before you start. I just literally mean the colours that you'll be using, if you already have marks on them, then be sure to just give them a little wipe over. The other way you can clean pastels, you can put them into a Tupperware container with some rice, and you can shake them around and it should clean the pastels, but that's quite a convoluted effort really. So let's get started, and the first thing that I'm going to do is to lay some marks. Today I should probably tell you we're going to be doing a peacock feather. So I thought we'd do something a little bit different and something quite nice and bright. Quite often we do trees and flowers and things like that. So I'm just going to make some marks here. When we think of peacock feathers, we always think of that eye effect that we get. So I'm just going to lay some marks, and it's important that you lay them directionally, because if you're doing fur or feathers, you want to be almost mimicking the direction that they naturally would grow in. So I'm just going to leave that kind of like that for now, because this is going to be sort of at a slight angle as we look at it. And the next thing I'm going to need is a sort of emeraldy, what we call a peacock blue. And probably the closest I would have is something like this emerald here. And again, I can match that to my pastel. So if I want to make some marks here, and this will also probably need some highlight on it as well. So just following on from those directional dash marks. So as I say, be careful to sort of work around, almost like if you think of a clock face and you think of the marks and how they move. Well, if they were at an angle, they would move. It's kind of that effect that we're going for. Just going to add a few more of these pale turquoise marks over here. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of the pale turquoise, very light pressure over the top of that emerald green, because this is going to be sort of the highlight from the light source. You don't want to necessarily cover up the whole of the paper underneath. You can leave some of that showing through. I'm going to use my darker turquoise here on top of that emerald green, and you can see it mixes differently as I'm laying it over the top. It's showing a different colour. And then I probably actually want to carry on down with this one, because we have an area here which is quite small. I'm just using lines, and you can see the end of the pastel is actually square. So if I'm using one of the points here, I should be getting some fairly fine lines with that. So do make use of those directional lines that you can create. So short little strokes up here, and then longer here. So we're starting to create the shape where we see that eye pattern. And be careful not to rest your hand on the paper, so try and sort of rest your elbow on your table and then just keep your hand off of the paper. That will actually help you to maintain a position where you're not smudging over the top of your work. And then this will also come, so the marks kind of go like this here, because we're continuing with the kind of flow of the feather. You think of how so for example, if I just very, very gently put a line in here, this would be like the spine of the feather. So we would be thinking of the marks coming off to the left from the spine and coming off from the right hand side too, like this. And then that way you get that almost herringbone pattern. And then we're going to just continue that along here. So can you start to see that kind of eye of the peacock feather starting to emerge in the middle here? Now this is where we get very close to our substrate colour. So this blue is a slightly different shade, it's more bright. So what I might want to do is just lay it down, see how it looks. And there's going to be an area in here where the light is catching. So we want to almost make that look slightly lighter. And then again here, these are quite fine, delicate lines coming up. I might even want to carry some of that down into the herringbone. So some of the parts where you can see the paper underneath, just add some of that just to show that we've got that herringbone detail going on. And then the top part of this I might want to just make sort of slightly purpley. Just add a hint of that on there. And again, don't forget about where the directional lines would be when you think of a feather coming out from that central branch. And now I'm just going to go back to my green here, maybe add a few highlights just to vary the tone. Coming out from that turquoise, the light turquoise. So there we go, it's starting to just build up now. And then when I'm coming around here, I might just sort of very gently curve the lines because we're coming out at a slightly curved angle. And again over here on this side. So we don't just have one flat tone of green, we've got those highlight areas as well. So you can start to see, I hope, that we're starting to build our peacock feather. So I'm going to go back to my dark green there, and then I'm going to put some of that in here. We want to keep those lines. What you might want to do, just to actually help you, very, very faintly, is to just think of that angle of where the spine of the feather would sit, and that will help you to keep your sides separated. So here, I'm going to want to come down to my central spine. When we think of feathers, they're quite soft and delicate, and that's how you want your lines to be. So not so soft that you can't see them. You want to be making a mark on the paper, but you want to be thinking of those lovely directional lines. Some of these sort of carry on up here. Just a few though. And I might take my dark turquoise and just add a couple of bits in here. And then think of my central line there, just sort of very lightly put that in. I'll just show you the difference as well that using a pastel pencil would make to the line. This one's a little bit in the A&E, I think. It can be a bit tricky to sharpen, so sometimes we have a few accidents with pastel pencils. They're a little bit delicate, bless them. So you can see very similar colour, very similar effect on the paper, so there's no major benefit at this point to using the pastel pencil over and above using these sticks. I don't know whether if you've got these, if you've got the larger sticks, if you do find them a little bit too chunky, you can always use one of these sandpaper refining tools just to kind of get your points down. Or you could use a piece of sandpaper. This is basically just a posh kind of block with sandpaper on it. It's made by Derwent if you do want to find one, but you don't need it. So let's just compare and contrast with how this would look. So this is actually giving me a finer line. This is actually easier in some respects, which is interesting. But it's fun to experiment if you do have different sort of tools to do the job, if you like, and how they work and how they compare and contrast. I've also got this Rembrandt set here, and these ones are quite round. I won't test them out now. So I might want to also look at the Emerald pastel pencil and just see how it compares. It kind of feels more natural when you use a pencil, because we're used to, when we draw, using a pencil or using an ink pen or something similar. So it feels kind of more natural to be holding something like this as opposed to a sort of a chunky stub in your hand. But I wouldn't say that these half sticks are difficult to work with at all. I think they're quite simple, really. I'm just going to give my fingers a wipe again so I don't start transferring things across onto my paper. The other thing we might want to just have a quick look at, and I'm always very wary of using black. Let me just see if I have a grey. No, I only have a pale grey in that particular set. So what we might want to do where we've got those darker areas is to just, if you do have pastel pencils, you can just go over and sort of redefine those dark spaces if you like. So it will allow you to do that. So if you're working on a toned ground like I am, and you're using something which is dark, you could always use a navy or a purple, or if you want to make these areas between the sort of the tufts, the strands of the feathers darker, then you can. So I'm going to carry on with this darker turquoise. I'm just going to lay those, which I'm going to find a sharper point. You might want to experiment with your corners that you have and just see which one feels best. Some of them might seem a little bit blunt. So we're starting to get these strands of the feather coming out now. And the other parts we've got up here are kind of yellowy orangey, so I'm going to start to put these in there. You have to be a little bit careful when you're working around between warms and cools, so you need to take a little bit of care. And because I'm going to do a larger area, I might just want to use the side of the pastel to kind of lay that area of colour down, because there's a very distinct area here. And then I might want to use my finger. So if I'm going to use my finger, I need to check whether it already has colour on it. So this is where we start to get that nice interplay between blended areas of soft pastel and unblended areas. We have the blended areas here in sort of the background, and then we have the unblended areas here in the foreground, because this is starting to lay the background to the composition. So I might want to put a little bit more of that, because I've got a very dark colour underneath, so I need to kind of cover that over. And then I want to encourage this pigment to stay on the paper. So I'm going to give it a very sort of gentle tickle. It's what I call encouraging the pigment into the paper. There we go. And remember, never blow pastel dust around your work area. It's not good for your health. So I also want to quite fancy this colour here actually. There's some orangey parts which are just showing through, and it's more orange towards where the ends of the feathers are. Let's give my fingers a wipe. Just make sure that your fingers are dry before you go back into the pastel. And if you're very close to where a large warm area and a small cool area exist on the paper, just be very careful, otherwise you're going to start to mix the colours and create secondary colours, which is not necessarily what you want. So just be a little bit careful around those areas. You can also pat pastel into the surface. So if you want to do something a bit more gentle, or perhaps you've got some kind of particles around the edges that you just want to encourage in without sort of blending too much, you can just pat and then just give your fingers another wipe off. I'm going to use one of my trusty brushes, which are just at the side of me, just to encourage some of this dust off of the surface, and it will also show me how much is going to carry on sitting on the paper. So you can see I've got some particles here. So I give my brush a wipe and then just flick it off. There we go. It's much safer than blowing the dust around. And I might even want to just add some slightly lighter tones in there. This might help to cover some of those darker areas that are showing through. And again, just encourage them in using kind of linear and circular marks. There we go. And we've kind of created that background area. I might just need to encourage some of that off of my paper. If you want to clean the brush, don't clean it on a baby wipe, just wipe it on a clean dry rag. Well, it's not clean, but it is dry. You know what I mean. Right, let's get the green, and then we're going to start to come up from here. I'm going to lay that down next to the yellow, and then we're going to have some more of these kind of frondy bits coming up here. And this is where pastel pencils are useful. If you want to kind of feather something out at the ends, it's just easier to do with a pastel pencil, but honestly don't worry if you don't have them. There's something you might, if you like pastel, you might want to add to your kit later on, but it's really not necessary at this stage to do so. I'm just going to lay this down next to the... So don't worry if you're using the sticks, it's fine, not a problem. And if you've got any sort of yellowy bits, just go over them carefully with your cool colours. Give my fingers a wipe. So in here, I'm just going to lay a little bit of dark between, just to give a bit of definition. You really want to, if you're going to put a darker value in, you want to sort of do it last really. So once you've sort of settled on where these elements are, then put your dark in. This is just going to give it greater contrast really. I might want to kind of just vary the colour on that green, add a little bit of blue in there, just to kind of make it a bit interesting. And if any of your colour starts to look sort of powdery and dull, just go over. There we go. And then we've got some more kind of green coming up from here. And taper that down into a smaller edge. And again, you've got your spine still coming along at that angle, just to keep everything consistent. So don't worry if you're still working in pastel and I'm working in pencil, it really makes no difference. And as I say, if you are struggling with your pastel, just have a go at making a different edge on it. So have a play with, if you're feeling brave, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can use something like a knife to just, you know, sharpen an edge. If you're going to do that, then I wouldn't slice, I would just use it laterally, just gently across over the top of a bin, so you're not going to make too much mess everywhere. Or, like I said earlier, you could try sandpaper. Just going to move those to one side because they're kind of getting in the way. And these start to kind of separate further apart as you come down. And they start to kind of curve as well and create these interesting shapes. So we'll use that to our advantage. and then they kind of go off the paper, but they would generally sort of continue on. So it's almost like you're creating a pattern at this point. You're starting to look at where the lines fall. And start to introduce a little bit of curve into your lines as well. Just make them a bit more expressive. Just going to kind of sketch them in at this point here. I'm also going to take this lovely colour. This is, doesn't say what it is, it just says Pastel 44. That's not very exciting, is it? I'm going to add a bit of highlight onto the tops of these. And again, if you're using pastels, you could use something like this, or you could mix this with yellow, or you might even have a pastel that this is this kind of colour. This is quite bright, but don't forget you can always add a bit of yellow to your green in order to vary the tone and just brighten it up a little bit. Anything sort of yellow will always lift a composition. It's quite a nice colour to use, particularly if things are looking a wee bit dull. So it just sort of lifts things and brightens them. But it can also be used to kind of suggest a highlight, or where light might be coming into the composition. Just have fun with it. This is quite an expressive piece. It doesn't have to be super lifelike. If you want to make it more abstract even, you could. Just sort of try and keep it lively and fresh would be my advice. It's quite nice to just add some of those highlights on there. And you can see it's really lifted it, and it provides a nice contrast to the background as well. So in here, I'm going to lay down some more of this, and this time I'm going to try it with my pastel pencils. Now you'll look at this and say it's much easier to use something this small to go between those lines here, and you're probably right, it is. It's not cheating, but equally I could just find a fine point of this, just come down here, just draw a careful line. It really is 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's just that we're used to holding something like this, and so we think it's easier because it's familiar. But it's really very, very similar. So it's your choice. So don't worry if you don't have pastel pencils, just persevere. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because it's quicker for me to do the detail while I'm teaching in the video. So it's kind of a little bit of a shortcut. So there we go, just block out that. And then I'm going to add some of the orange. It does allow you to use more linear marks, so if you want to kind of create a variegated background, you can. And I might even want to use some of these other sort of more tangerine-y type of colours. Creates a bit of interest and variety into the background, and also we're creating contrast between the colours too. When you're putting things like yellows and blues or reds and greens next to each other, it has a value of visual interest because it creates contrast. I need to be a bit careful down here because I think I've laid some dark blue, so I can always brighten up that tone with a bit of light orange, like so. And I might even want to go back over here just to create a little bit more coverage because that background is showing through. Right, I'm going to carry on filling in the background details over here, and then I'll come back in the next video and work through with you how to do the remaining pieces.